The hour. The Hangout is now live, which means we're now recording. Welcome, everyone. This is the Thursday Hangout of Week 7, and there's just so much to talk about. We had a great Hangout on Tuesday for the folks on the other side of the pond, and although we kind of have folks from all over, right, Di? So it's really nice to be kind of going into the integral concepts in this chapter. We're going over chapter 4. And thanks, Zach, for the correction about the numbers. I was actually just out today, and I didn't have the book in front of me when I was publishing that email, so got the numbers wrong, but it's actually, like you're right, it goes up to 66 or something like that. But yeah, chapter 4, the new concepts. I know we kind of started to go into this last week, but and Tuesday, but there's just so much here. There's so much information. Gapester is going into some clarifications for the meaning of diaphany and cystasis and synaresis, if I'm pronouncing any of those things right. My book personally is just covered in notes and post-its and things that I don't even know what I was talking about when I was writing down these things at the time. So this is certainly a chapter that's packed with a lot of information. And I saw, Marco, you posted a little kind of Instagram-y looking picture of towards the end of the chapter. He's using these key terms, which I thought to be very nice and kind of refreshing, just to not have to read dense prose and just kind of read it as a kind of creative list. So yeah, let's just go around. And let's just start with Di. Di, if you want to just sort of share your impressions with your reading this week, if you're up to this chapter, what your impressions were with it, or something that stood out for you, or if you're somewhere else, that's fine too.
Yeah, I'm all over the place because I thought, I don't know what happened to chapters 3 and 4, creativity and the new concepts, because you're suggesting we're reading 5, 6, and 7. So I browsed those. I couldn't wake up Wednesday morning early enough for you, but I listened immediately. I did to Tuesday's Hangout and loved it and wished I'd been online. And this morning I just read the end of chapter 7, so I'm kind of, I'm not at chapter 4 at the moment, but I have looked at it previously, so I'll just leave it there, otherwise I'm wasting time. Except sure. The one phrase that really struck me was the possibility of deperspectivization. Yay!
Whoa!
And also a new method that is no longer three-dimensional.
Yeah, he opened up the chapter with that, didn't he, talking about that?
Yeah.
I have that highlighted all over the place. And we were talking about that last Tuesday, as you probably remember from the recording. Just this whole idea that what Gapester's talking about here, we haven't really done it yet. We've been trying to articulate it, and maybe in fiction, maybe in my thinking, and maybe in creative work, we've done this. But in terms of methodologies, integral methodologies, I don't know. Have we really kind of second paragraph broken out of this systemization, spatialization? But how about Kim might still be eating her sandwich. How about Marco? Marco, what was your impression of this chapter?
It was a tough chapter, actually. I found myself struggling through it. And if we're speaking specifically, just to be clear about chapter 4, the new concept, and it sort of blends in for me with the previous chapters on the new creativity and I think the new mutation. I don't think I actually have much that interesting to say right now, except that it was to me, in my experience of it, it was a dense chapter, and the stuff about non-Euclidean geometry, for example, was very hard for me to follow. I tend to think geometrically. There's one fellow, Jeremy Strawn, right? Who has posted a number of things on the forum and who was at the Gebser conference in October, who did a presentation on non-Euclidean geometry. And I got lost in that too, which was interesting. It felt good to be lost a little bit, to have a sense that, whoa, this is something that's beyond my actual ability to like visualize, which I think is partly the point, right? Is that our capacity to visualize is our spatial capacity, it's our mental capacity, right? So if we want to understand what aperspectivity is, or what this time dimension is, then in the way that Gebser is suggesting that we have to not visualize it. We can visualize it. I mean, that's part of it, right? That's the mental part of it. And then there's also the mythical part and the magical part. And there are these different dimensions of time, which Gebser talks about as timeless magic, temporicity for mythic, and then time as a concept, as like a spatialized concept for mental. And then what's integral time? What's aperspectival, arational, acategorical time? Like that is I think, the crux of this chapter, and I don't understand it, frankly. I think I have a sense of it, but I, at least in the way that Gebser goes through it here, in this sort of very meticulous, I want to say abstract, but I don't know if that is the right word to describe it, but this very sort of intensive way, I think I need to digest it a bit more, actually.
And just to quickly mention, you mentioned about not being sure what to read. The way we've been doing this, I know it's a little obtuse, but the way we've been doing this, we try to read we try to talk about last week's reading as we're reading new things this week. So we don't talk about things we're immediately reading. Although, I mean, we're all over the place. So we're
I don't
reading 5,
actually
6,
do
and 7.
that. I'm reading at the last minute for the call.
I did that last week, and luckily I've just heavily read this chapter, so reading it again is a little easier. But just for clarification, you don't have to do it. It's just the way we were trying to work in the timing.
Well, I'm finding it very helpful, actually. Sometimes if I've heard the discussion about it, I find I'm able to read it. Yep.
Gotcha.
I have one word I want to ask when you finished your rounds of where everyone's up to.
Okay. Okay, so how about next, let's have Peter come in if you want to unmute yourself, Peter.
Well, I did try to read a little bit today, and what came back to me was how much effort I put into in the previous reading of trying to figure out what cystasis and syneresis was. And when I was reading again today, I didn't have any more clarity on that. I'm still kind of confused by that, and I have the sense, though, that if we struggle with it and try to figure out what he's trying to say, that might be the key to getting to what this time as a fourth dimension is. Marco's already talked about the the non-Euclidean geometry. As you know, a math person, I'm kind of interested in that. But what really struck me was his parallel with the Petrarch story. I thought that was really interesting. I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. It's just struck me as very curious. I don't know. I guess that's about all I have to say on that.
Don't you love that when understanding just kind of slips away when you come back to your read? Doesn't make as much sense. Yeah. Okay. How about Taylor? I know you're coming in here sort of at a right angle with what we're reading, but you said you read the first 2 chapters recently, and I guess I would just be curious as to if you've been revisiting Gebser recently. What are your impressions with your more recent reads, or even just following along at our conversations on the peripheral? Any insights?
Yeah. Well, firstly, right now I'm just looking. There's a nice summary of all of Gebser's ideas, or at least a good chunk of them, at this website called GaiaMind.org -Gebser. They have so that's what I'm looking at right now, and I'm reading a lot about this idea of cystasis and cinerasis, which is new to me. But basically, I read this last semester. I read the first 2 chapters of Gebser of present origin, which is basically the perspectivity chapter on pre-perspectivity, perspectivity, and aperspectivity, and then also the 5 entries of consciousness. So I was reading Gebser. I'm currently writing a book about secularism, and I had this sort of pining question as to what exactly secularism is. I feel like this is something that we throw around the word secular quite liberally, but we have an idea as to what it actually is. And I actually felt that Gebser's approach to mythology was one that was rigorous and one that could assist me in understanding the mythology of secularism. Especially when it comes to the Greco-Roman gods that populate the mythology and the whole cosmology of secularism. Gods like Libertas and Justitia and all these gods whose phonetic roots have evolved into these words like justice and liberty, and Gebser was a mastermind with linguistics, and he knew how to repurpose language to his own purpose, to repurpose it into his own intention, sort of. And I really admire that aspect of his writing. So I'm kind of just utilizing some of his ideas to extrapolate on my own ideas of secularism right now, and I'm still kind of trying to grasp these ideas of cystasis and cinerasis just from what I'm reading right here. But yeah, I'll jump in here and there, but I'm also happy to talk about my writing, of course, which is pulling from Gebser. I quoted Gebser in the one page I'm writing. So yeah.
Very cool. If you're interested, you're more than welcome to kind of share with whatever you feel comfortable sharing, just about your writing on the forums on Infinite Conversations. If you want some feedback from us, we'd be happy to brainstorm with you or just converse with you about these topics. Yeah, so let's see. Zach, how's this chapter going for you, Zach? And then we'll jump back to Kim.
I was in the same position as D, and I was kind of confused about the schedules and everything. And I read this chapter, I guess, almost like 2 weeks ago. And so it's a little bit pale for me. At the same time, it was like one of the clearest chapters I've read so far. Like when I was reading it, I was like, yes, this makes sense. Thank God. I mean, it's not just the chapter. It's also like, I myself tend to go through like fuzziness to clarity, like cycles in my own life throughout the week and months and whatnot. And so I just happened to read it on one day where my mind was working really well. But what was I going to say? I don't know if it was in this chapter, but I was having a hard time for a long time understanding what he was meaning by structures, because he was defining structures as non-spatial, and in our current day, it seems that structures have a very spatial element to them. The connotation is very spatial. And I think in this chapter, he talks about how structures are the interrelations between various elements that are pre-spatial because they actually inform the way space and time are experienced by us. And I was like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, as structures is a series of interrelations. But I couldn't figure out if it was in this chapter, but I thought I read it in this chapter. And then I feel like there was one other thing. Oh yeah, I think Marco, you got it correct about the Euclidean geometry bit. Like it it is beyond our conceptual mind, and that really like hit me whenever it was like, oh, we can understand things even if we can't see those things, even if we can't visualize those things into three-dimensional space, we can still grok those things in a certain way. Anyway, I thought that was really cool too. That's all I got. I'm kind of tired today too, so my mind's in a fuzzy place, not in a clear place. But anyway.
It seems like we're all kind of in this little reading fatigue.
Oh yeah, that was another thing I was gonna say was that like over the last few days, like I was like super stoked about. I've been super stoked this whole time, but maybe over the last few days, I've been like, I can't read this anymore. so yeah, there's some reading fatigue going on.
I think that's par for the course with a book this large. So
anyway.
Cool. Well, okay. How about Kim? I see you guys are talking a little bit about cystasis in the chat box, but we can get to that in a moment. How's your reading going, Kim?
I'm still enjoying it. I found myself getting a little bit like where I was spacing out between, I guess in chapter, The Nature of Creativity, chapter 3, I started noticing my mind wandering and thinking about my day while I was reading, which I haven't done while reading his work up until that chapter. But I actually read this second chapter a couple times, and it was less clear the second time I read it, which normally doesn't happen either. But there's a couple things that really, the one thing that really stood out to me, and it's kind of in response to what Peter said, that just really intrigued me, and I had like that aha moment, and then when I read it again yesterday, I'm like, I have no idea what that means. But it was important enough that I put like a little, like, you know, orange tab on the page and I could find it later, and that was talking about cystasis. And I just like this, and I put it in the window there so you can read it. You don't have to listen to me read it, but that really stood out to me in terms of like, as like a really important concept to really just get a feel for. I'm not quite sure like I can explain it, but like I just was like, yes. Shit, I have no idea how to explain it to anyone else, but I just felt like that really stood out for me. But I'm hoping maybe y'all can tease that out a little bit, because it just seemed, I could like feel my brain like crashing on itself through my body when I read that line, and I really want to kind of feel it, if you guys can put some words around that concept. So I'm excited to be here. Hi guys.
Awesome. Yeah. Do we want to just jump? I mean, hey, we got reading fatigue, but that's all right. We're gonna tackle cystasis tonight, I think.
Jeremy?
Yeah.
I remember trying to look up the word cystasis, and I think if you break the two things apart, cis means same, right? And stasis means stand. And Di just put up a definition that said joining. And then there was another definition that used the word synthesis in there. And then that's when I get confused, because he seems to be saying that this new consciousness is not systemization. And he's trying to use cystasis. So here's what I think, anyhow. Cystasis means standing together. So if you have these different, what's the right word, ideas about time, timelessness, temporicity, a quantification of time, in any concrete situation, to have those different elements of time all kind of like just standing together, not put into a synthesis, but just standing together. Now it starts to make a little bit more sense, because he says syneresis is a process of integration. So I'm trying to figure that out. What would I do in like my everyday life? Would I just try to look some things in my head to just, with respect to time, to just put them together? And then what is this syneresis? Is this some kind of, spiritual process that kind of just automatically takes over, or is it something that I have to do? I don't feel it's something I have to do. I don't know. Does any of that make any sense?
Yeah, Kim, I was looking at you smiling. Yeah.
Well, it's as I feel Peter struggling with this, I feel my heart getting really warm. Because I feel the struggle. The struggle is real. Because it's for me, it's like it's not a thought as much as it is an awareness, and it's sort of like an intuition, yet a clarity at the same time of. And I hate the word, but the word connection's coming to mind. But like this, I'm just gonna read this out loud because this is to me where it just like came together was. The stasis is the means whereby we are able to open up our consolidated spatial consciousness to the integrating consciousness of the whole. And for me, what I kind of feel is I just feel like I have access to like all like information. It's not information necessarily, but just what is. And so it opens up an awareness into, it's almost like this idea of like, okay, well, if I've done the same thing over and over and over and over again in my life, and I've tackled the same problem over and over and over and over again, what is that moment where all of a sudden a space opens and I notice a different way of seeing the world or an openness? And it's almost like that thing that is the space that's not even a space, but it's just the awareness of something else. And it's like it's self-evident. It's like self-evident when that awareness is there. There's a doing, and yet there's not a question about it because there isn't a resistance. It's like you already just know what to do because it's already happened because it is, and you're aware of it, and you just are. And it's like I know that's really blah 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 blah, but you know I'm kind of just getting the feeling out there of like that, and I start sweating, and my feet are like itching when I say this because it's like it doesn't make any sense here. But it's like, oh, it totally makes sense. Like I can see it, but it's I don't see anything. It's like, oh shit, like it's that easy. And it's almost frustrating. Like right now, I have heat in my back and like I'm sweating because it's just like I can't even explain it. But I'm just putting it out there in your direction, Peter, because I can feel this from here. And I kind of want to just take your head and like pull you back and pull you down into your chest and pull you down into your toes and give you a big hug. Because you're going to get it more there than you are if you hit your head against the computer.
Well, Di had a good quote actually from Feuerstein. And this is worth mentioning just for folks who can't read the chat. Systasis, in contrast to systemization, deals with a proper arrangement of intensities rather than quantified extensities. And I think it's kind of saying around the same thing. But Kim, the way you're describing it, I really like that. There's something about it that's like, it allows it to kind of do the integration itself. It's not like you're forging these beams between these structures and going, all right, so this fits here and this fits there, and I have a mental conception of these relationships. It's, you know, he's saying that like there's a way to feel into those living connections, those arrangements, those living intensities, and the proper arrangement of intensities isn't our properness. It's actually something bigger than our ability to conceive it. So it is kind of like, whoa, how do I even I want to sort of pull back my mental desire to kind of conceptualize and grasp. But on the other hand, I think the only analogies I'm drawing to this kind of description of systasis is artistic connections, where you're like coming together in a creative way and things are actually combining and forming together. And when you feel like, whether it's a poem or a work of art or a story, suddenly things are just sort of clicking and working together, but they're not they're not being forged by you. It's more like you've discovered, the next passage. You've discovered the next, like, what your characters are going to be telling you next. It's sort of like it was already there. So I just, when you were describing it, I'm like, yeah, it's a little bit like kind of the artistic and creative process in some sense, or whatever we're doing when we're feeling into those relationships.
Yeah.
And discovering those things, like Ursula K. Le Guin writes about, like, kind of journeying into these worlds as if they're like as if she was an archaeologist of the future. So again, I'm just kind of riffing on what you're saying, but it makes sense to me.
Yesterday I was at our corporate office, and I was talking to an admin assistant who was quite insightful, and he actually described it in his own way, which was really interesting to me, I thought. And he said to me all of a sudden, he said, Kim, wouldn't it be really interesting? And he told me this story, and he told me about a story where he just trusted his intuition, like he had a feeling, he did it, he didn't question it. And all this stuff came out from doing this, and he's like, I don't do that very often. He was like, can you imagine living in a world where we trusted that all the time and we all trusted it at the same time? And to me, like, I was like, well, that's a really, like, that just resonated. And when I went back and read this, I'm like, it's kind of like, and I know intuition can be like a charged word for a lot of people. So, flow, or, the trance state that an artist gets in. Like, I don't know what a good way of describing that alignment is, where, because I always get the sense with some of those, it's like very mental or very, like, a very thin line. But imagine your whole, like, being was open to that level of, like, alignment of intensities. Like, that would be kind of cool. And then maybe, like, your vibrational, like, intensity being aligned, like, is like a tuning fork for other, like, beings too, and it just kind of helps to realign the system.
So does anyone else want to give
Sorry.
the list?
I really appreciated, Jeremy, your bringing up art and the artistic, the creative process. That actually really clarified something for me, because I was trying to think of, like, I was trying to get into the word systasis, and trying to kind of feel it more so than think about it. And I think, Kim, that's sort of what you're introducing into the conversation. And that made me, like, I went back to the text. I think I'm echoing. I went back to the text. I went back to the place where he first mentions the word, and then he has a little footnote where he describes what it is. In Greek, it means put together, connection, but it also has the connotations of forming and origin. It expresses a process whereby partials merge or are merged with the whole. That's page 292. But then I started realizing this is still really mental, like, or at least I'm relating to it in a really mental way. And when I think about, like, say, writing a poem and everything that goes into that for me, it is a constellation of intensities. And it's like, even for, like, one word of a poem, I might need to live, like, a month's worth of time and thinking, or something may need to happen. Like, there's some event that occurs that opens up what that word is and what it means and how it constellates and how it means in relationship to the other words and, like, to the poem as a whole, and how the poem means to my life and how my life relates to what's going on around me and in the world. And so that begins to clarify for me also what the time dimension is, because it's like these things happen in time, right? Like, they unfold, and yet, like, their wholeness, you couldn't say, like, exists in a particular, like, location, and you couldn't even, like, locate the time in which that wholeness unfolds in some kind of coordinate system, right? Like, because it creates its own sort of sense of what time is, if that makes sense. So anyway, I'm just saying this because, like, I had a little insight, or it felt like I had a little insight, and it had to do with the embodiment aspect, and it had to do with, like, the artistic, creative aspect, which might be, might lead into, maybe we should talk a little bit about chapter is it 3, about the new creativity. We didn't talk about it on Tuesday, and it might be like this missing link between the different strands of the conversation here.
That's a really good point. Just about that chapter. Um, just talking about origin and creativity, and I know he talks about the muse and kind of the evolution of poetry in that chapter a little bit, which is very interesting. But something about what you said about the constellation of intensities really clicked for me. And about 2 years back, 3 years back maybe at this point, at one of the Gapester conferences that I ended up going to, I talked about like sort of digital artwork and its sort of origins in the 1950s and 60s, and the cut-up method, and this whole idea that even when you break down all of these items that seem to have some separate or fragmentary nature, you can kind of see through them to find a relationship or some kind of structure that binds them together and brings them together into some kind of coherency or expression. And I found that to be sort of at least alluding to diaphony, but what we're talking about tonight for me is like really helping to flesh that out and understand it a little bit better. So yeah, I don't know, did we want to hop back to the creativity chapter, guys? Would that be alright?
Before we do that, can I offer my ideas about the cystasis thing?
Please
and
do.
It might sound oversimplistic, but something clicked in me, and the other day, and to me it's just a felt sense of the different constitutional elements of the structure. As opposed, I mean, everything you're reading in Gebser is systemic because there's no feeling in Gebser. He has to present it in a systemic way, but he makes sure to say that that's not what integral is, or that's not what aperspectivity is. You actually have to have the feeling of the system as well as the understanding of the system. And then I was looking in the book and I couldn't find where it is either, but he says how do you say the other one, syneresis, is the completion of the integration of the cystasis and system. So then you have both the external system and the internal cystasis coming together in completion and syneresis. Anyway, I don't know if that was simple or unsimple, but it seemed simple to me. Anyway.
I thank you for that. Actually, that I really like what you said. A felt sense of the constitutional elements in the structures.
Yeah,
that kind of helps too. Like we're talking about art and creative works and how we can feel into those works and feel their relationships, but he's kind of asking us, like, if these things are not just mental fabrications, then you're going to have to feel into what the structure is. Not just, okay, here's a work of art, here's another work of art, here's a category for what these things do, here's the relation to time, but it's like, no, what is that feeling? What's the felt sense? And I think he's kind of alluding to that the whole way through, and now he's really kind of emphasizing that importance. But I think you're talking about, does he mention that in the beginning? Beginning of chapter 4. I thought I saw something about system here. Maybe not. Oh, yeah. Diaphony is based on syneresis, on the etiological, that's another word, completion of cystasis and system to an integral whole. Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Integrality is only possible where temporal elements and spatial magnitudes are brought together. So.
Page, please.
That is page 334. That's the let's see, third paragraph.
Or maybe a really quippy way to say it would be the cystasis is the territory of the map of the system.
I don't know. I don't think I like this word cystasis very much. It sounds static to me. Like if I just feel the word, if I have no idea what it actually means, or what Gebser intends it to mean, or maybe there's a translation issue, I don't know. but the word itself, it sounds like putting together something that's static. And maybe that's a misunderstanding of it. That's just my feeling about it.
It sounds like a cryogenic freezing chamber, just a sci-fi story. Like, yes, he's in stasis right now.
Yeah, right. Cineresis, though, and however that's pronounced, that has a little more intrigue in it for me. Just like as a word with like poetic potential, it seems to have some heart to it that cystasis maybe doesn't have.
You know, I wish Ed was here this evening, because I think he might be able to give us some insight on the German text. If anybody has the German text, it'd be interesting to see, like, did Gabester originally use these words, synaresis, cystasis? Were they translated into something else? I would just be really curious about how that translation took place to come up with these words, and what the differences are in, like, English versus German, and are they just as kind of weird in German? I don't know. But yeah, do you want, Marco, was there a specific or a page or some area of chapter 3 that you wanted to sort of revisit?
Oh, I don't know.
Clarify?
I didn't mean to shift the conversation that way abruptly. Like it didn't. After I went there, which I also did in the last Hangout at the very end, I'm like, hey, we didn't talk about chapter 3, and I didn't mean to. It just sort of came out of me, and it's probably because it has to do with creativity and has to do with poetry, and I've been thinking about, I think about poetry a lot, but this week in particular I'm going to be reading a poem at an event, and I don't usually do that. I don't really do like poetry readings or anything like that. I would like to, but I just don't. And so this chapter is about poetry, and it's about poetry as sort of this exemplar of creativity. And he says some really interesting things about like kind of the process of writing, or sort of the way that the poet relates him or herself to his sources of inspiration, or his sort of practice of manifesting, realizing, concretizing, like the thing that the poetry is about. And I think, I wasn't sure why I don't know exactly what was drawing me to talk about it, but perhaps it is like this way, at least it's a way. For me, it's certainly a way of getting, like grokking, like what these what these sort of fourth dimensional dynamics are kind of about, and like how they work. And of course, it's different if you're doing geometry, and it's different, if you're doing, any other form, any science or art or just living. But I think the poetics provides it just provides like one portal into understanding it. And there were a couple of things that struck me about this chapter in particular, which is that, one of them is that he kind of deposes the idea of a muse being sort of the privileged source of inspiration or of guidance, for the poet. And he goes into his linguistic thing and talks about the relationship between the word muse and the must and music, of course, and amusement is one he didn't mention but came to mind for me. But he kind of comes to the point where he's saying like the poets that are like, in his view, aperspectival, or like kind of like expressing this mutation, this integral mutation, they kind of don't just regress into this mystification kind of thing, or this sort of, those elements are present perhaps, but they're superseded by what he calls a clarity, and the way that he describes like getting there is, it's like not this like ecstatic transport. Like he seems to think like that the inspiration that would come from a muse, or from these states of consciousness, that they they don't produce like the new poetry. Like, but he's saying that the new poetry comes from this patience and this sort of like, activating the different dimensions, right? The different dimensionalities of time and experience, but also like transcending them at the same time. He doesn't use that word transcending, but it seems to be that that you can like contain them without like speaking out of them specifically, if that makes sense. So we might actually need to go to the text and get like a little bit more concrete about what he's saying, but it was really to me it struck me because my poem, the one I'm reading, it starts with this invocation of the muse. It sort of like recapitulates the beginning of the Iliad by Homer, which of course is a big piece in this text. That's where the menace begins, the mental menace, which comes through as rage, right? Achilles' rage at the beginning of that poem, as he's about to go into battle with the Trojans. And so where I don't know where to go with that exactly, but it's got me just rethinking like how I want to write poetry, I guess. I mean, that's maybe the first thing that it's doing. But I think that it relates to like I think our lives are poetic. It's like we have events, things that happen, and even if we don't write them formally as a poem and like put it out, there's this way that we could look at sort of the events or the details or the aspects or like the feelings, all the dimensions of our lives as these poetic moments, and it's like that's a beautiful thing when we can do that, actually. I think, and that's all I have to say about that. Yeah, Zach.
I just wanted to read he talks on page 320. I marked this as like important because, like I was saying in the chat, it's very close to this sort of poetry I've been experimenting with, like accidentally on my own, where my poetry is just the poetry of my being in the time and space I am on stage, and then I allow like whatever my being is to come up and try to be expressed through myself, independent of whether it's boring or interesting or inspiring. It doesn't matter. I'm just trying to express being as poetry. And so it says, while the present-day poet strives to overcome the time-imparting remembrance by abjuring the muses, this is an expression of his aperspectival endeavor. His concern is not primarily with the merely ponderable or mental, nor with conceptualizing the mental or mythical, but rather with the perceiving and imparting in truth of perpetual plenitude, the whole or integrity which is permeated by the spiritual energy of origin. Anyway, I just thought that was really amazing.
Yeah. I want to hear that poetry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd love to read that kind of poetry.
It's not that cool often. Oftentimes, like I said, it's really boring. Sometimes it gets really interesting. It just really depends.
But what are we relating to there? Like it sounds like like there's this poetry of what's arising, and like the letting it arise, but also like imparting it with the intentionality that that it comes through you, that expresses itself through you, right? So we're relating to something, even if what's arising is boring, or it really doesn't, like that's the thing with bad poetry, is that it sort of tries to conform to an idea of what poetry is, right?
Yeah, totally. I guess I should say also, it's like, boring in the sense that it's not mythic. Like it's like oftentimes poetry I read or I hear people reading is like trying to invoke some sort of like emotional or mythic reaction in people, and it's not interesting in that sense, I guess is what I mean.
It was interesting on the same page on 320, a little bit up. He's describing a little bit what you were saying before, Marco, about the muse being related to the mental. And he says the muse is an expression of the mental attempt to grasp the non-mental, and this means preeminently mythical truth. As long as the muse dominates, man is moving within the mental sphere. And he talks about this 3,000-year reign and Homer, and how that's sort of beginning to die, or becoming siren-like, angels of death, like in Rilke's poetry. I find that to be really interesting. I don't really know how to relate it directly to poetry or art, but in terms of consciousness studies, something that Bill Thompson and also probably Wilbur and even Gary Lockman in his most recent work, Secret Teachers of the Western World, talk about the sort of few thousand-year-old history with the left and the right brain. But just thinking about mental consciousness being this consolidation of dimensionality and I guess egoification, the self in linear time, the mortal being sort of disconnecting from this sort of imaginal collective unconscious and moving into waking consciousness. To me at least, and again, it's sort of just like a placeholder for a deeper understanding, but it seems like he's saying that this mental space that we've been continually we've been inhabiting it in a more intense way as we've become more and more material and secular, et cetera, over the past few thousand years, and separating ourselves from these like other dimensions or other spiritual realities. That's no longer the focus of this new poetry. It's no longer the muse trying to speak to the unconscious. It's no longer even maybe Jung, the analyst, speaking to his unconscious and writing it creatively. There's a new relationship that's taking place, which could, I don't know, is what he's saying more of. Zach, you're mentioning volition and like being in truth, which is an interesting proposal from an abstract in an abstract way, in the sense that we're not sort of going back into that earlier structure. We're not going into myth or magic. Even though there's powers and intensities there, and different temporalities there, we're going into some other way of relating with these muses and these forces and these powers that are sort of out of time, beyond time, through time. I don't know. I'm just making sense of it in my own head through consciousness studies. But it seems like he's saying that this mental person, this spatialized person, is no longer what's writing and being creatively inspired, but now there's some kind of more direct relationship and intensity going on. Zach's saying being in truth, imparting truth. Yep, letting it happen, making it happen. I'd be like really curious though. For a chapter just talking about poetry, I need to read more of what he's referencing in the poets he's referencing in here to get more of a concretion, I think. But okay. So, does anybody want to chime in as well? Riff?
I want to leave space for anybody else who wants to say something. But I guess I'm talking now, so I'll just say one quick thing, and that's that Gebser doesn't talk about this, but there's this idea of emergence, right? People often talk about like what wants to emerge, like what is emergent, and I think that there's a connection. Like he didn't use that language. That might be how we kind of in our culture talk about it, and I think that one way of relating to poetry, which maybe could connect it to other areas of our lives, is like this question of what is emergent, what wants to emerge, and then how do we relate to that? Because I think poetry does that as well. Like for me, what I'm beginning, maybe this is also what Zach was touching on or invoking, is like that the poetry that's interesting is like that the poetry that is, I don't know, heralding or kind of bespeaking like what's emerging, like what wants to happen, what is not yet kind of like manifest, but begins to like take shape through the poem or through the process of writing. And I wonder, maybe one way we could go with the conversation, kind of open it up, would be if you guys resonate even with this idea of emergence, is like, how do we relate to what we sense wants to emerge? Like, is that a way of, could that be sort of a way of doing this stasis or this integrating in time, like move, right? Could that be the way that we enter into the perspectival?
I think I could chime in here. I'm just trying to give you guys time to sort of reflect on the readings because I'm sort of an outsider here. But I think Jeremy mentioned Wilbur, and I'm sure he's been a kind of a specter for your conversations, as he has more material. He has some controversial takes on Gebser, at least from and a purist point of view of Gebser. But I think Wilbur is actually helpful in our understanding of the secular. Jeremy kind of conflated just now the materialism and secularism, and this is why I'm sort of analyzing this notion of our current notions of secularism, because I think Wilbur, one thing that he is good at is he considers the secular as a space to be a gift of spirit, of God, if you will. And I think that's a really important thing to take into consideration, because if we're saying that we seek this retrieval of mythic, of the muse, then we're ignoring the fact that the secular as a space, if you know the Heideggerian term Lichtung, which means clearing, it's like a clearing in a forest where these truths can emerge. And so this space in and of itself is a gift of spirit, according to Wilbur. I've read that somewhere. And I think that's a really important thing to take into account. Also, the problem with kind of seeking this retrieval of the muse, of the rational, of the mental stage of consciousness, structure of consciousness. First of all, I find it problematic that Gebser was sort of glorifying the Iliad as an expression of mental sort of, and I don't mean to conflate mental with rational as Wilbur does, but the sort of the expressions that we find in the Iliad are very barbaric if you look at them in a sort of if you consider them to be an expression of civilization. I think that's a very bad misreading of them. The Iliad is full of rape and plunder and idolatry and all these things, and I think the Persians really need to be exalted for the influence that they had on Greek philosophy. Heraclitus was heavily influenced by the Persians when he was imprisoned with them, and he further influenced Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. So I think that we shouldn't dismiss. My main point is that we shouldn't dismiss secularism as being merely material, because it is the space where all truth can arise, whether it be material or spiritual or theological or biological. It just so happens that it's kind of been taken advantage by materialists for their own purpose, in my point of view.
It's an interesting definition. I haven't really heard it used that way. Secularism.
Yeah, I try not to even call it an ism at all, because it's a querying. I love that the Heideggerian term is what I'm using now in my book, Lichtung. It's a clearing like in a forest, where these truths can arise. I'm trying to have a new definition of it.
It seems to me that you, hearing myself echo again, like maybe one way of distinguishing between the secularism that is a clearing and that makes new things possible is like with Gebser's idea of the efficient and deficient forms of these structures. Because, I mean, the same mental that's a clearing in Heidegger could also be the enframing, that in Gebser's terms sectorizes the world, divides everything up, induces the oblivion of being, induces the forgetting of origin, and so it's I think that you're right to want to preserve the importance of the value of the secular, of spatialization, of the mental. And I think that probably part of what is happening in Gebser is that he's so intent on differentiating the integral from the mental that he can be really harsh on the mental. And he's really like interested in containing it, you know, and sort of purifying himself of it. It's interesting because the same thing happens in Wilbur with respect to the postmodern, or the green meme, is that you know there's such a intense sort of preoccupation with differentiating what integral is or what second tier is from green or postmodern or first tier that you really kind of start to demonize the structure that you're trying to differentiate yourself from. And you know, ultimately, even though like you'll pay lip service, like of course you don't want to do that because you know all the structures are important and there are healthy expressions of them all and so forth and so on. Gebser does that same move. Wilbur does that same move. In practice, in the tone of what you're saying, and in the kind of you know the whole transmission of what you're saying, you are demonizing the structure a little bit, and then we get caught in that and it becomes its own like little kind of prison, little trap. Because we need the mental, right? I mean, the mental is like just as co-constituent of our being as anything else. But of course, it's become perverted and you know is used destructively all the time. Yeah, and you know this is we're talking about this book. Just to bring this back, I mean, this is written right after World War II, right? Or kind of in the midst of the aftermath of the First and Second World Wars, which a lot of people saw as manifestations of, like, the mental just totally gone awry, you know? Technology, specifically, you know, being used to inflict mass horrors, you know? And in some ways it is a manifestation, again, of the same energy that is there in the Iliad. Right, that is there in the menace. Like you could draw a straight line in some ways from the Trojan War to World War II. You know, I mean, it's maybe not a straight line. It's probably got a lot of turns and twists, but you know, I mean, that's like the synthetic sort of perception. I think is like seeing these interconnections between manifestations.
Doesn't he caution against looking for patterns like that too?
Could you repeat that?
Well, I mean, you're making what I heard was kind of like a correlation between the two wars. But doesn't he caution against doing that as a mythic sort of cycle type of thing?
Hey, Taylor, if you don't mind muting yourself, I think it's echoing back through your mic, just because I see it hopping back to your videos.
I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem.
He cautions against it, but then he makes like he makes these parallelisms all over the place that are even inconsistent in his own writing. But I don't want to like get super into that because I'm trying not to be critical of Gebser right now. I'm just trying to understand Gebser. Anyway.
I'm thinking about like if I was gonna like when I first heard Marco say it, I kind of thought of like a timeline and like correlating, and then when you said that, I could see it a different way, where it's like if everything's right now, and we're gonna make a relationship between the two in terms of like the structure of consciousness and like where that was in that moment. Like from one state of mind, there might appear to be a relationship, and another, like how that actually plays out might be different. So it's like it would look like it, but there's like a different outcome that could like be seen from it based on where you're at. So it's like maybe repeating, but not, because it's like, I don't know. I can see it, I just can't say it. I'm just gonna be quiet.
I found it interesting, just to kind of kind of riff on this. On page 324 and even 323, just talking about going back to this new poetry, because I'm just trying to anchor into that. He's talking about, am I pronouncing this correctly? Halderlin? Um, what is it?
Something like Hölderlin.
Halderlin.
Something like that.
He's describing Halderlin as passing beyond the abysses of the soul, nature, and the confines of the ego. And again, I'm just looking at Gipser's language and his descriptive language in this chapter, like describing his poetry. No longer are the spirits invoked or dispelled, it is the spirit that speaks. And then on page 324, he's describing, there's that poem he quotes, and then about halfway through the page, he says, the shift in poetry manifested by these examples is should be apparent by now. There's a detachment from memory. The initial step toward the supersession of time, that's what he's defining it as, detachment from memory is the initial step towards the supersession of time. And then he says memory is always time-bound, and what is even worse, it temporizes the timeless without transforming it into temporal freedom. And then he just also mentions that this poetic emphasis shifts from recollected past to the present. So I don't know if this helps anybody else. And he also quotes Hofmannsthal remarking that poetry as present. This whole idea of like a supersession of time, a shift from memory and from sort of recollecting the past to the present, and the shift to the present. But I don't know, does that speak to us anymore? Because I would imagine that 50, 60 years of poetry and art has kind of even, there's something else evidencing itself, not just in poetry, but also in, let's say, like something as banal as like remixing, right? Different songs from different decades. This is such a common technique now, and yet it seems to me anyway, it seems to be intensifying what Gibser's talking about, the sort of temporal freedom where different times are all kind of chiming in and speaking and singing and talking to each other in this invisible, this intensity, this relationship that's difficult to describe. I don't know if that would be time freedom or not, but it certainly is very interesting, and it seems to be kind of another element of this. But I haven't read a lot of poetry, haven't read a lot of modern poetry, so I don't really know what the equivalent is in poetry to something like this.
I picked that idea up on page 327 with the little gidding, history is now. So that paragraph, having talked about detachment from self and from things and from persons, here he has said this is the use of memory for liberation. And then he quotes, the moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. History is now. I think that's where that idea that you were talking of, Jeremy, came into focus.
It's very interesting, the history is now thing. This is just sort of an inception of an idea, but with contemporary digital art and music and even the internet, a lot of I've been hearing it thrown around that we're sort of like outside of time now, we're outside of history, history can no longer progress. There's this sort of economic statement with Fukuyama, but then there's also this sort of cultural statement that, it's almost like we're all in this ever-present moment with each other, and it's intensifying, and things are happening, but there's not really a sense of history progressing anymore. And I kind of wonder if that's not just a stagnation, but also something more, something else is going on, maybe in our globalized, noeticized society.
Emergence.
Yeah, on the emergence thing, I think, Marco, you were talking about that earlier, and you're talking about time. I went to my graduate degree is in emerging media communications in the School of Arts and Technology. So they're just trying to it's like a giant stew of computer science, art, communications, and social media. And what what's interesting is like in the social media side of things, like 5 or 6 years ago when I was just going through the program, like this idea of like asynchronous and like communicating where you can communicate anywhere in the world immediately, and your communication you can do at any point, and someone can respond at any point in time. When so you're actually connecting in that moment, but you're communicating at different points in time. But you're connecting when you actually make the connection, whenever that is. And that's what like I'm observing in the organization that I work for now is people are getting really just sort of like this idea of channels of communication. So it's like, is it email? Is it conference calls? Is it voice over IP? Is it the social media platform? Which social media platform is it? Is it going through our software technology? So there's like 20 channels of communication where you're like almost like, was that an email? Was it a text message? Like all of that going on plus time. And the only way that I can like search for things or connect anything now is through like search. Keyword search and like knowing the person's name. So we're kind of going through this panic exercise in my company of like kind of like going, holy shit, we've got multiple languages, we've got different time zones, we're global, we've got multiple channels, and yet we're still trying to all like get something done. And so at least in that context, it feels a little bit like when I got hired on my first week, the CIO goes, hey, look, I know you're here to do this thing. He's like, but I hate unstructured data. And what's funny to me is like that was like the mental telling me like, I know what you are. You're coming in here to mess with things, and I'm not comfortable with that. And so it's been like 5 years, and yet like I can't really tell you like what I see that they don't see, but it's just like really apparent to me that this is happening, and all of these different things are coming together. And what I was kind of going to reading this was I was really questioning, I think it was in chapter 2, he was talking about how it's not just like a relationship between things, but it's an integration. And I'm thinking about like the Internet of Things, or the fact that Microsoft has like just recently completely switched their strategy to like enterprise collaboration, and they're going with like a big data model because they acquired another company to try and like put something on top of their software to connect things, and now they're realizing like, oh, it's really about a totally different approach, which is through Active Directory. Not to geek out, but I'll be really brief. Active Directory really manages your individual profile through all of their applications, email, any of their offerings. Like your Active Directory profile tells like the system who you are, and thus it would tell you like where you're at, what language you speak, what time zone you're in, who you're associated with, what keywords you're using, who you're communicating with, how often you're communicating with them, and if those products are integrated out in other system or other applications or systems or your refrigerator. I mean, nowadays it could be your cell phone, your refrigerator, your Nest. It doesn't matter. And so I'm wondering if like this technology aspect of things of integration and the way that we're looking at like connecting humans, and yet the big data piece is going to kind of like have an integration effect in terms of connecting people like automatically, whereas now we have to go out and seek things. Like those things are going to find us more and more, which is what we're seeing in the corporate world. It's like I'm associating myself with certain things, and those things are finding me as more and more parts of my activities are integrated into the whole system. So it's almost like this intelligence that's emerging on its own, but it takes both the big data piece and the individual person sort of like their presence. And so I'm just like, I don't think we're quite there yet with technology in terms of like, because right now I think it's just that thing where he's talking about relationships and having more relationships to more things or more apps or more, stuff. But like there's this thing that's happening that I can see at work where it's like these systems are about to literally just implode because it isn't integrated. There's too many individual ways of approaching the problem that haven't been really understood. So that was kind of my riff for the night. But I'm just seeing like a hint of this chaos that's coming into our organization because people aren't quite able to like control it, so they don't know how to deal with it, and yet it's happening regardless.
Thanks for the riff on new media here. This was good. For myself, oh, I hear a bit of an echo. There we go. For myself, I actually did part of my graduate degree on new media and like Gapser and Integral and like Teard and looking at a bunch of these people. So it's just really exciting to hear someone else make this similar connections, more firsthand experience wise. But yeah, there's an interesting element of a sort of, watching these patterns and the big data come. That's not. There seems to be a combination of like massive system making with developing like things like Facebook, but then also like just totally just developing tools that allow us to see the natural connections and the structures that are there and like work with that. So kind of like working with human ecosystems and where is attention going, where is focus going, where are people clicking, and what are the hours in which like people go on Facebook or blah blah, SEO and things like that. They're trying to like sort of tracking human currents of attention and culture and interaction. At the same time, they're trying to create these infrastructures around them, but it's like partly organic and like partly systemic. So it seems to be again this sort of Janus face thing, where the internet sort of like this eruption of this thing. And another interesting aspect of it is that this is sort of thinking about it in this way. I don't know if we're going to get more people thinking systatically, or syneratically, just by using these tools. I think it will take some degree of sort of thinking about it, or thinking about thought, sort of like you mentioned on page 326 as well, about ideology and philosophy, sort of like being aware of how we're doing these things. But anyway, I don't have a concluding thought with that. Just riffing on you.
I think that that's really kind of the crux of the problem. Like that's like the present moment is dealing with our exploding reality, right? It's just that there's so many screens, channels, interfaces, different times, different spaces, and we're interacting with each other and either trying to get work done or communicate or whatever we're trying to do. And it's beyond our, I'm just speaking generally here, but I think it's like beyond our ability really to handle. And there's one little moment in the book, I want to keep kind of grounding this in the book, where Gebser talks about the possibility that there might need to be like a physical mutation in people to be able, like that corresponds to the integral mutation, the spiritual mutation. And I wonder if, from our vantage now, we might start to think about that in terms of like a transhumanism or a sort of network, like a networked intelligence that we kind of emerge into. That I think probably involves some AI, right? That's like really just helping to do a lot of the work of presenting us with the most relevant realities at any given moment. Because it could be hard, like for me, like, all right, do I answer this email? Do I read this article on Facebook? Do I try to get something done? Like I get into moments where I don't know what to do. There's just, I get there, there's some kind of like, chaos in the system, and there's too much input, and it's like I have to practice with that, like take breath, be mindful with it. But part of it, so there's like an interior aspect to how I deal with it, but I think part of it might be just like an upgrade, to our humanity. Not to put it in, techno-utopian terms, but that seems to be pretty much what's happening, right? I mean, whether or not we think it's a good idea, it seems to be happening.
Yeah, Zach is posting some cool stuff. He's mentioning Bruce Sterling, calling it Baroque information structuring, focus on quantity, capacity, etc., instead of quality, where technology gets behind of us instead of in front of us. I like that idea, and I was thinking about a similar thing, what you're saying, Marco. Just in the fact of developing these kinds of technologies, what does that? First of all, developing that kind of thing sounds very, quantifying and spatializing and mentalizing, but maybe it's kind of needed. Maybe this sort of deficient rational sort of needed to be able to sort of work with an exploding information world, as long as we don't just like mirror that ourselves entirely, you know. So if we can get that behind us instead of in front of us, what can we then do as human beings again with all of this information, with the technology helping us, looping back into, all right, so can we find relationships now? Can we find connections now? Can we be more left-brained and right-brained in that sort of way, or somewhere in between where we're not really mentalizing and spatializing because we're sort of automating it sort of where it belongs, and we have the capacity and intelligence to keep growing those automations and those computations when they're necessary, but there's also something else that we're now able to do or freed up to do, you know. Dai is mentioning the ultra-human in Teard. Interesting. Zach, did you want to comment at all about that quote and that dude?
I was going to put a link to the book called Shaping Things, which I think is an accidental, integral, like writing on the way technology, especially information technology, has grown throughout the course of human history. But he basically says, like, we're in a place where we have this kind of ostentatious, maybe that's the right word. Like, we really want to show off our technology, and so like we have iPhones or our phones, and they have like 1,000 apps because we're like, we can do everything. It's so awesome. But in the end, it just gets in our way because we get overwhelmed, and it doesn't do anything for us. And so he talks about like the next generation, and I think you're actually starting to see it a little bit with things like Siri and Google Now, where there's some intelligence behind the app that tries to support us instead of just throwing random things into our attention fields all the time.
The movie Her comes to mind as well, sort of like a version of like take Siri and like actually make Siri like really good, what he or she does, and I feel like I love that actually. Like I need like a technical like AI sort of assistant, just kind of take care of everything for me and just let me be a person. Instead of like trying to always manage all these systems, all these connections, etc.
What would the mutation look like? The physical human mutation?
That's a good question.
Well, I mean, you go the first route of like kind of like an interface or an intersection, like or like like Google Glass, or like are we gonna have chips in our head? The government route. But I'm imagining like I don't really fantasize about like having any more metal in my face than I already do. I have titanium plates, which might explain a thing or two. But like I don't fantasize about having like technical hardware as in my brain somewhere. Like that's just not appealing to me today. Maybe it will be next year. I don't know. But like, what would a natural like an organic mutation be that would really? What would it look like? Feel like? What would it be like to like what made our little brains like? Is it just another region in the brain? Is it like what is it?
I think we're thinking of these things on material terms, which is the problem. If we're talking about something that's interior, then I think I'm reminded, in just listening to this, I'm reminded of Nietzsche's obsession with nobility that you come across throughout his entire writings. He has this obsession with creating a culture of nobility, and I think that's sort of the missing link. It's not a physical mutation; it's an internal mutation that needs to occur, where we as individuals embody this emerging culture of nobility that we see occurring. Hopefully we're a part of that movement as well, where we see this emerging planetization occurring, and we feel obliged to partake in that spiritual movement in fostering within ourselves a culture of nobility which infects the people around us and infects the whole planet, hopefully, in a good way, a good kind of virus.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I think these things also tend to, even if they're not in ways that we currently measure or acknowledge, they do affect our physicality as well, whether it's like another, like, better connection in our brain between more parts, or that kind of thing. Like for me, it's like my nervous system. Marco, I think you'll remember my unicorn comment about for me, reading this book has had physiological like discomfort associated with it, not necessarily in a bad way, but like I can feel myself, getting like a little, third eye headache, or like my chest opening, or like, I want to go throw up when I'm reading, or I need to take a nap after like 10 pages for like the entire book. So it's like I feel like it's working me in a way where it's like the thing that I like about Gebser that I was missing in Wilbur's work is I feel like Gebser like grabs me by the hand and like is dragging me down this sort of like, I'm gonna just push you off the mutation path even if you don't understand what you're reading. So I feel like I feel like I'm getting kind of pushed a little bit to grow inside to the extent that I can based on where I'm at, and I feel it, but I'm kind of like kinesthetically oriented, and then the clarity of mind comes next. Or maybe it's the other way around, I have no idea. I just feel it first. And so I can definitely feel this opening me up in a way, and I can see it in my life as a clarity as well in my actions, but I'm just wondering or feeling like the relationship that I am able to have to objects or with technology or with people has been greatly made of ease. Like it's easier. That's all I'll say is like I don't have to worry about the managing piece that Marco was talking about quite as much, because there's like this intensity of stress that's, for me, at least through the course of these last couple of months, just, I don't know, I think that transparency piece ends up translating into a sense of ease or relaxation, and it's like I have a better sense of where to put my attention without really trying. And so it's like there's less shit my wired wrong in my thinking about things or my emotions, like that piece where it's like really the mythical and the magical and the rational and a better relationship between those systems, if they have correlating like brain regions or whatever, I don't know, maybe they do, but it felt like just a few tweaks in just the way that I was relating to my own intuition or sensitivities. I noticed more clarity in even how I understand my emotions moment to moment to moment. So I'm not wasting as much energy on things that are taking me out of presence. When he's talking about memory, you guys have talked about these readings a couple of times, like history is now, and what the purpose of memory is. Like to me, all of that really comes together in how we relate to our emotions in the moment. And so for me, the clarity and the ease is coming, but it's not like, Zach was saying, it's a constant practice. But I agree with what you're saying. What's your name again, Thomas? Taylor. Shit. It was a T.
Taylor. Yeah.
Hi, Taylor. Thank you.
Just want to also mention we had one or two comments that I had neglected to check in the Q&A box, but Jaron just says hello. Could have hopped on, Jaron, if you want, maybe next week. And then also Karen mentioned an interesting thing with relation to cystasis. She says, I've been relating cystasis and system and four-dimensional diaphony to Valera's self-organizing systems and maybe Luhmann or Luhmann's autopoietic social systems. That's awesome, actually. I hadn't really made that direct connection before, but I should probably revisit those, especially Varela, his writing on autopoiesis. It sounds like there's something definitely there that's...
there's the poiesis there as well.
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. I'm just going to write a note for that. Might be a book we want to read at some point. There's a couple of good ones by Varela. And Evan Thompson as well. I can't remember the name, but quite a few interesting texts there. So, Peter, I saw you on mute before. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but if you do have any thoughts, I'd be curious to hear what you've been thinking about.
Well, I think what I'm going to say is very different than what the conversation has been, and I've been debating whether I should speak. And earlier, I think Marco said something about, what wants to emerge. So, what's in the present moment for me right now? I guess that's what I want to speak to. And I don't know if it's going to be valuable to the conversation, but I'll give it a go. Um, I'm noticing, and I noticed this on Tuesday too, that the whole hour and a half goes by and I hardly say anything. And I probably give the impression of, not having much to say. But what's really striking to me is that, tomorrow when I start interacting with my students, I have a tremendous amount to say. And I seem to be able to draw from things that I've read, particularly Gebser and other things too. And I'm curious about what the difference is. Um, and I think as I listen to the conversation, I'm always obviously trying to pay attention to what's being said, but I'm also trying to pay attention to what the nature of the conversation is and how can I take from this and so augment, I don't know if that's the right word, but improve maybe my conversations with my students. How do I take what I hear in here and bring it to my students? And I'm a little frustrated because I don't think I can at all. Um, I don't know how I would communicate what I got out of this conversation tonight to them. So the reason I started to think that I wanted to speak up was when Marco said something about there's just so much information and we seem to need some kind of physical mutation that matches a spiritual mutation. And when I hear that, my mind goes to Tailyard and the last part of his book where he says the collective way out. That's what I think. What I think is there's just too much involved here for one human mind to absorb it all. And I think you people are amazing in terms of what you've read and you're able to retain and speak. And I think some of you know, Jeremy and Marco know that I'm trying to create a nonprofit. I call it the New School, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in that is to try to create some kind of a structure that would allow for the assimilation of all of this information and all this sort of theoretical stuff and be able to get it down to a level where the young people that I teach can understand it and start to, well, integrate it into their lives and maybe even start the mutation process for them to open up their consciousness. I don't know if this is making any sense, but that's what's present for me in the moment, and I just felt like that's what I needed to say.
Peter, what do you sense is the gap between...
I can't compete with you guys. I think I'm a kind of a smart guy, and I've read a lot, but the way you guys talk, I don't seem to be able to jump into the conversation. I mean, you make so many connections, and you leave me spinning. And then, but when I'm talking to my students, I don't get that. I don't know if it's because I have the sense that they know less than I do, and so I could just, I don't know. I don't know what the difference is, but I know. I don't know. I guess I'm just going to repeat myself.
If I may say,
I want to be able to. My reason for being here is that I'm trying to see if I can deepen my own understanding of what Gebser says because he's made a huge impact on me. I know that, and I want to try to translate it in a way that my students can understand when I talk to them. I've really killed the conversation, haven't I?
No, I'm curious. I want to ask Peter. I've described a couple times like how I'm struggling to describe the impact it's had on me. I'm starting to see more as more time has gone by, but I'm curious if you could think of one thing or one insight or something that you've noticed as a result of it. Like, what would an impact be that you've been able to notice? Can you put it into words?
An impact of reading Gebser on me personally?
Yeah.
I think it's taken me a long time to realize. I mean, people told me all my life that I'm an up in my head kind of guy, and I think I'm excited about the possibility of superseding. I love that word. Superseding the mental three-dimensional rational consciousness. I mean, it's clear to me that we have to do that. And I'll say another thing that I was thinking during the talk tonight is that nobody ever made any comments tonight about our current political stuff going on. And to me, it's really obvious that the deficiency of the mental consciousness is extreme right now in terms of that dialogue, political dialogue. And it seems to me that we're not going in a very good direction, and some people are starting to use words like scary. And it seems to me that what Gibbs is talking about is a potential for superseding the deficient consciousness that seems to be so prevalent in the world today. And I don't know, that's the impact. You asked for an impact, Kim. I think that's the impact, is that when I read him, I feel a possibility of maybe getting beyond where we are right now. And then I start to feel my insufficiency to bring it all together. I don't feel like I have the mental power or whatever to do it.
But I love what you said earlier about, like, you don't have to do it all. You only do what you do, and I do what I do, and Marco does what he does, and that's very liberating because we don't have to solve the problem. It's already there. It's a matter of tuning into it, and part of tuning into it is relaxing our mental, and then.
I actually got a thing about like how I view myself. I think my aspiration is to be the Bernie Sanders of consciousness. And what I mean by that is I want to get a stump speech. I don't need to be a brilliant academic. I just want a stump speech that's going to hit what's going on with the students. I want them to be, whatever I say, I want them to be able to respond and say, yeah, you're putting words to what's already going on inside me. And then I think I could die a happy man if I just started that going.
Thank you.
We need a Bernie Sanders of consciousness.
Yeah, that's a pretty good phrase, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
I think I'm good at stump speeches.
I got this. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, I'm all, and I think the conversation's done. I just killed it.
No, not at all. No, it's good to come back here. We're at 90 minutes anyway, but
I just want to say, I mean, honesty keeps the conversation alive. I mean, that's really the kind of core thing that keeps the conversation alive, I think. So, we may go into, we may go into all kinds of areas, but I think bringing it back to what you just did, which is like, what is going on in where are we going as a people, and what are we doing about it? Like, that's a fundamental question. We can't lose sight of that. And I think that there's something noble to bring in Taylor's idea of Nietzsche's nobility in that intention. I think that I don't necessarily want to get political right now, but I think that's part of what people are responding to in Bernie Sanders is a sense of integrity, a sense of nobility, even though like he's this New York, Brooklyn guy who is not the most polished figure, right? But what's coming through him is a sense of integrity, and people are resonating with that, and I think that's what's really needed in a situation where there's a massive amount of a massive lack of integrity, in our systems and in a lot of our behaviors. So I just want to say, run, Peter, run. I love your contributions here, and I think that this idea of the collective, or this idea of distributing consciousness, distributing the load, is really important. I mean, that's part of my intention for even doing this is because I realize I'm not going to do it alone. Like, I need other people. And I have something I think to give, but there's a lot that I don't have that other people have to give. And if we can kind of pool our resources, our intelligence, I think we can start to figure some things out. I mean, what other alternative do we have other than to try to figure things out and try to like create something new, try to actually bring about this aperspectival world? I wouldn't even talk about it in those terms. I mean, that word aperspectival maybe won't resonate with your students. You know, like maybe just a different languaging is what you have to find.
You know, just to kind of riff on what Peter mentioned, if you don't mind going another minute or two, but in that list at the end of the new concepts section in that chapter 4, Gibson mentions the supersession of patriarchy, the renunciation of dominance and power, the acquisition of intensity, clarity. Even you know, I mean, I could relate this in a poetic way, the mastery of movement. I'm just thinking of movements, of collective movements, and sort of what's going on right now in the United States. If we would touch on that, there's a kind of rejection of this sort of ornate obfuscation that sort of occludes the reality of injustice and power dynamics, and we see that obfuscation is actively resisting transparency, and transparency is coming to consciousness right now. Diaphany, renunciation of power, supersession, like these things are coming to consciousness more, and I think we don't know how to make that world yet. I think like you're totally on point there, Peter, about this is something that will take all of us, take everybody. So I feel like, you know, that's to me where Gapes are speaking to today in this political moment. And of course we have the reactionary things, and of course we have sort of the politics as usual, which is very mental, which is sort of, all right, here's where everyone fits on the grid, and here's how we play them to get what we want. And we can sort of create a progressive politique, which is not really progressive politics, but just sort of used to mask these power dynamics. So people are seeing through that. There's like a feeling of seeing through these things, and I think that's one of the strongest values or structures that are coming into emergence right now. So thank you for sort of leaning into the present moment. Literally, it's the present. It's our present. It's where we are right now. Gibster's always talking about the present. Well, this is it. You know, this is our moment. So yeah. Cool. Well, I guess does anyone have any closing thoughts before we?
I just wanted to say one thing to Peter. I just want to say I really resonate with you. Especially regarding like how to get this stuff out there in a way that is easily kind of like digested and understood. It's like if I had any purpose at this point in my life, and I don't think I do, which is great for me, it would be to do that to make the whole of human, what human potential is, accessible to as many people as possible. Yeah. So that's all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zach. That's beautiful.
Before we close, Di asks, asks, sorry, asks what we should be reading for next week.
Well, I have. Okay, let me check my schedule. We'll be discussing 5, 6, and 7 allegedly. I mean, we finished 4 tonight, I guess, so we can move on to 5 and 6 next Tuesday. But in terms of week 8 reading, I have written down here 445 to 504 and chapters 8 and 9.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody.
Bye. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do we need some kind of formal thing? Or?
Well, we'll see you. We'll see you next week.
All right.
Thanks all.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy.
So yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye,
Marco.
guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bye, Di. Taylor, nice to meet you, sir.